Big Star Wars fan, eh? What's your favorite?
Oh, probably the first ones, honestly.
Can't top 'em. Darth Vader, Han Solo. Whew.
No, I mean like the first ones chronologically, like episode 1 and 2 and all that.
Oh. Well, I guess. Wait, you prefer those?
Yeah, they're super cool. The world building is great, and
Acting's horrible. And who wrote that dialogue? Like the first parrot who ever learned English?
at least the finale is cool and dramatic and not filled with teddy bears.
Hey, those were era appropriate.
What does that even mean?
Whoa, guys, relax, okay? There's no need to fight. Star Wars is always good. Both of those trilogies are great. Shouldn't we just be thankful that we have all these awesome movies to talk about and discuss with our friends? What are you, a sequels fan? Hey man, Kylo Ren is cool as hell!
Not as cool as... With 3 different trilogies coming out in such distinct time periods, it's only natural people would tend to gravitate towards preferring the ones they grew up on, or even just the ones they watched for the first time, or the ones that actually got them into the franchise. As such, people inevitably have a bias towards which trilogy not only do they prefer, but which one they think is truly superior. As a massive fan of the franchise who didn't really get into things until a little bit later in life, I think I am uniquely qualified to answer the age-old question. Which Star Wars trilogy is truly superior? I've devised 8 questions in an effort to tackle this question, ranging from stacking individual movies from the 3 trilogies against one another to things like characters and production. We'll award 3 points for a category win, 2 for second place, and 1 for third place. Then we'll tally up the points at the end and axiomatically declare an inarguable best trilogy in the franchise, thus ending a debate as old as religion. But before we dive right on in, make sure to leave a like and subscribe for more content like this in the future. But without further ado, let's begin with the first question. Which trilogy has the best opening movie? Now, although 99% of people here are going to have the same answer, which includes myself, I do really think The Force Awakens deserves a massive round of applause. It had sky-high expectations, and in my opinion, it lived up to them really well. It borrowed in a nice way from A New Hope, giving us a lot of familiar beats and recognizable elements, all while telling a tried-and-true story in a new and engaging way. There's interesting main characters, a very interesting antagonist, some guys we already love, some twists, some turns, some mysteries. It's got it all. This is a movie I really love revisiting, as it's one of only 2 I've seen in theaters, and I would say this was probably the movie that officially got me into the Star Wars franchise as a bit more than just a casual fan. If this movie were being ranked against a handful of others in the franchise, it might come out on top, but unfortunately for it, A New Hope turned this franchise into a phenomenon for a reason. It's really good. Perfectly paced, iconography out the asshole, incredibly ambitious to the point of influencing nearly every piece of sci-fi that has come out ever since, all while telling an interesting story with a perfect flow of information and excellent characters on both sides. Even simple things like the names, Jedi, Sith, Darth Vader, Chewbacca. Mwah. This movie was incredibly ahead of its time, and some of the practical effects are out of this world good. Questions about Lucas's master long-term plan aside, this movie lended itself perfectly to a sequel and began one of the most iconic, lucrative, influential franchises in history. A New Hope simply has to be number 1, though Force Awakens at number 2 is probably the narrowest gap between 2 movies we're ranking during this section. Oh, and Phantom Menace absolutely sucks. Some viewing guides actually recommend skipping this movie altogether, which is what we did when I introduced my girlfriend to this franchise, and now she's a huge fan, so... It's slow, boring, uninteresting, it's got lame characters the movie refuses to allow us to connect with, and a lame story to tell. If this movie were the first one in the franchise to ever come out, I am reasonably certain this franchise would have sputtered out pretty quickly. 3 points to the original trilogy, a solid 2 to the sequels, and a 1 to the prequels only because my scoring convention doesn't allow for anything less. Which trilogy has the best middle movie? The original trilogy, obviously. I consider Empire the best in the franchise, and although I actually like a lot of the elements of The Last Jedi and absolutely consider it a good movie and a welcome addition to the franchise, it's simply got way too much going against it for it to even be in consideration against a juggernaut like Empire. I have a weird soft spot for Attack of the Clones, but I assure you it is not because it's a good movie. It has one of the messiest, most bizarre plots of any film I've ever watched that isn't trying to be chaotic and nonsensical. It's really fun to watch, but when you take a deep dive, nay, a shallow dive, the moment you've broken the water's surface, you're hit with so many plot holes, plot inconsistencies, plot contrivances, wasted characters, boring subplots, bad dialogue, a little bit of character assassination sprinkled here and there. Yeah, no, I'll take The Last Jedi and its nuanced themes and interesting exploration into vastly different takes on characters and relationships any day of the week. Empire is one of the best sequels of all time, checking off all the right boxes that make a sequel work, such as building on the world in natural and interesting ways. This movie expanded on the Force and truly made it into a metaphysical and omnipresent thing. We were introduced to characters like Yoda and the Emperor. We explored our characters in this world a little more, and we ended with one of the greatest twists of all time. It's hard to imagine now, but when this movie first came out, the revelation that Vader was Luke's father absolutely shattered worlds. This one's super easy, and funnily enough, the exact same order as before. 3 points again to the original trilogy, 2 to the sequels, and 1 to the prequels. But hold on to your hats here, folks, because this one's where things get interesting. Which trilogy has the best finale? We are shaking things up in a significant way. None of the movies here will be receiving the same amount of points as the prior two categories, which isn't saying much because there's only so many ways you can arrange 3 items without duplicates, but still, the conclusion to the original trilogy works in a lot of ways, but fails in far more ways than its two predecessors ever did. The final battle scene with Luke, Vader, and the Emperor was great, but it played out concurrently with not one, but 2 other storylines we cared far, far less about. So although the final scene we all think about when we say finale to the original trilogy was great, it was actually only on screen for a third of that final act. Plus, the opening third is convoluted to the point of Attack of the Clones being jealous, and this is the only movie with noticeably worse acting in the trilogy. The actual conclusion is great, but most of the rest of it ranges from not bad to pretty disappointing, and they don't build on this world or the elements we've learned about much at all. An okay finale, but at least it's better than the one we got in the sequels. The Rise of Skywalker makes several of the largest flaws I've ever seen this franchise make, such as bringing Palpatine back from the dead with zero foreshadowing to be this franchise's big bad for the 3rd time in 3 installments, while also making our main character inexplicably related to him, making the world feel extra small, which is a huge problem I have with this franchise, and also spitting right in the face of The Last Jedi, which this movie does a lot. A chaotic fetch quest with ill-timed humor and so many fake-out deaths that the stakes begin to feel as though they never even existed to begin with. It's hard to recall the good parts of this film when recollecting because so much of it is so painful to think about. Why did they make Hux into such a joke? Why did they cram the Knights of Ren down our throat 90 minutes before this trilogy ended? What is the point of this?
Ray, I never told you Ray!
And why the goddamn shit did she declare herself a Skywalker? Even the most ardent defender of this trilogy, of which I sometimes am, cannot defend the majority of this shit. My god. But Revenge of the Sith is fun as all hell and easily my favorite to rewatch. It has oh so many problems, and if you fix them this could become one of the coolest movies ever made, but some of the flaws in a weird way can enhance the raw viewing experience because unlike The Rise of Skywalker or The Phantom Menace, these mistakes evoke tears of joy from laughing rather than tears of pain from crying. This movie reads unbelievably well on a Wikipedia page because shit like Anakin cuts off Mace Windu's hand while Palpatine electrocutes him to death then declares Anakin his new Sith apprentice before ordering him to execute every youngling in the Jedi Temple is a hell of a lot cooler than the actual execution, which is often devoid of life and cringy as hell. This movie was shot largely on a green screen, and you can fucking tell, but it's also emotional and fun and beautiful in a lot of ways, and I can perfectly see why some consider it to be the finest in the entire series, while others consider it to be one of the worst. I think it's somewhere in the upper middle, and although it's the least finale-y of the 3, since it's the only one they've ever made that already had movies set directly in the future, it is my vote for the best watch. 3 points to the prequels, 2 to the original trilogy, and 1 point for the sequels only because my scoring convention doesn't allow for anything less. Which trilogy has the best protagonists? Moving away from the movies themselves, for this we'll just be ranking the actual main characters from each trilogy, so no characters like Mace Windu or even Yoda. For the original trilogy, Luke, Han, Leia, Chewie, C-3PO, and R2. For the prequels we've got Anakin and Obi-Wan, plus we'll throw in Qui-Gon and even Padme. And in the sequels we've got Rey, Finn, and Poe. Also BB-8. And for this one, I guess sometimes quantity does equal quality, because the original trilogy has a host of distinct and lovable voices who are all someone's favorite Star Wars character, and I think that's just beautiful. Luke's growth is handled really well, from obnoxious naive kid to a wise and powerful Jedi. Han is one of the coolest aspects of the entire franchise, at least for the first 2 movies, and Leia is a great twist on the archetypal rescued princess trope, where she ends up being a clever, take shit from no one character who's even able to tolerate and learn to love Han and all his baggage. Chewie is great, and the droids have such unique personalities that are conveyed oh so well through beeps and boops and then excellent voice acting with really creative physical... acting? Do we call it acting at this point? Really creative physicality. I want to give the prequels higher marks because Anakin and Obi-Wan are both among the best characters in the entire franchise, but these movies just don't explore them nearly enough. A lot of wasted potential to be sure. Other media has given them excellent character work and growth and all that, but I obviously won't be considering that here. Likewise, Qui-Gon is given almost no real personality traits or motivations or a backstory or anything in Phantom Menace. And Padme isn't exactly given anything either, aside from a general nonchalance towards Tusken Raider genocide and an ability to be sadder than your wildest dreams. Interesting skills, but I don't think they're going to win her many points here. But back to Anakin and Obi-Wan, and they're still very cool and interesting characters, hence their eventual placement on this list. It's just that there was so much more that could have been delved into or explored that they just chose to ignore, which is so frustrating. At times we get glimpses into how close they've grown and that bond they've built, but we're never really shown how or why. The movies kind of just tell us to believe they're brothers and then reference old events we haven't seen as if we'll go, shared memories. When they are given moments to shine, they do shine, and I am not ashamed to admit I cry almost every time I hear Obi-Wan grieve over his brother losing his way so much that he no longer recognizes him, and Anakin screaming in hatred because of how ruthlessly he's been manipulated and taken advantage of. That last aspect in particular is something we should have gotten a lot more of in these movies, but I digress. And in a decisive last place is the sequels. I am a big fan of Rey, but I'm not going to sit here and tell you she's a well-developed character, and her lineage being tied to Palpatine and her declaring herself a Skywalker only lowers her in my mind. I find her really cool though, and I like her archetype as a purely good protagonist with all the Force potential in the world. Poe is super cool, and I really like him too, but he's not a big enough aspect of this trilogy, especially in Episode 9. And Finn is the single biggest waste of a character in this entire franchise. Such a cool concept in Episode 7, some backwards growth and poor usage in Episode 8, and then is he even in Episode 9? Probably the biggest waste of a role in the entire franchise for a good actor who had a great backstory, great internal conflict, and a lot of potentially cool ideas and stories to work around after his interesting arc in Episode 7. But instead they kinda just shoved him to the side. BB-8 is cool though, we like him. 3 points to the originals, 2 to the prequels, 1 to the sequels. Which trilogy has the best antagonists? Now, bad guys, and I actually rewrote this section like 3 times, mostly because I had a hard time deciding who actually qualified for this category, and then once I got my final results, I was kind of unhappy and wanted to see if there was any way I could justify altering it. But alas, my metric is sacred, and as such, we have our answer. I initially wanted to have one main villain for each trilogy, so Vader for the original, Palpatine for the prequel, and Kylo for the sequel. But it doesn't really make sense to exclude Palpatine from a list of original trilogy main antagonists. And quite frankly, it doesn't really make sense to exclude him as one in the sequels either. Regardless of how stupid it was, he was the main villain of the 9th movie, and technically was the main bad guy the entire time, even though they failed to even mention him once and they brought him back to life in the final movie for no real reason and with zero explanation. And for that, the sequels are getting punished. I originally had Kylo and the sequels getting second place because I think Kylo is a very interesting take on a Star Wars villain. Someone struggling with the pull to the light side, all while trying to force himself to become more and more evil for various reasons. His arc is great, his connection with Rey is super interesting, and his lightsaber is cool as hell. He's awesome. He's probably the single best element of this trilogy, but Palpatine being compared alongside him just tramples whatever good Kylo may have done. So in first place, we've got the original trilogy, and I think little needs to be said here. Vader is Vader, and Palpatine is perfect for this story. He had to be over the top, maniacal, and evil so we could believe in Vader's final redemption, and they pulled that off really well. The mystery surrounding him is handled nicely, and I think this is the best iteration of Palpatine we've ever had. In second place, alongside Palpatine again, is Dooku and the prequels. I didn't want to include Dooku here since he's only in one entire movie and he isn't really a super active antagonist, but he fits the same criteria as Vader in a lot of ways as someone acting on behalf of Sidious. And if the other 2 trilogies are going to have 2 villains, then the prequels needs to as well. Dooku is fine here. He has a cool backstory and his power is really believable given it, and then Palpatine is cool how he's pulling the strings on both sides, and his skills in manipulation regarding Anakin and the entire Senate is admirable. I like him a lot less than Kylo, but I like him and Dooku just a little bit more than Reborn Again him and Kylo, so that's why the prequels come in second and the sequels come in last. It's a damn shame, and I really wanted to give Kylo and the sequels some credit with a second place finish, but like a good majority of potentially positive elements in that trilogy, the Rise of Skywalker exists, and it has to deal with the consequences of its finale's mediocrity. 3 points to the originals, 2 to the prequels, and 1 to the sequels. Which trilogy has the best side characters? Anyone we didn't just discuss is fair game, either on the good side or the bad side. The original trilogy has guys like Jabba, the Ewoks, Tarkin, Boba, Yoda, Lando, iconography up the wazoo, and for good reason. These characters are all pretty important elements of their respective arcs, except for Boba because he's useless. And this group, frankly, is going to be pretty tough to beat. For the prequels, we've got guys like Mace Windu, Jango Fett, Yoda again, Maul, Grievous, and everyone's favorite Sith Lord Jar Jar Binks. There's a ton of other characters who could get little shoutouts too, like Watu or even someone like Shmi. This grouping is a pretty mixed bag. Some pretty odd characters, pretty divisive interpretations of pre-established characters, villains who seem cool and are cool, but are also pretty underdeveloped and somewhat useless to the overarching narrative, purple lightsabers, and so on. Kinda hard to analyze. In their usual fashion, the sequels are a bit odd here too. I've typically been listing characters who don't appear in a sizable chunk of their trilogies as side characters, aside from guys like Qui-Gon or the third coming of Palpatine because they're pretty much the main hero and villain of their respective movies. Therefore, Luke and Han will fall into this category, which is great because people like Holdo, Rose, Snoke, and Hux are not helping things here. Because of how great those 2 characters are handled, and even Chewie here, although it is a bit weird to list him as a side character here and a main character in the original trilogy, but I just think he takes on more of a passive role in this one in the absence of Han. But because of these guys, this category becomes a lot tougher, maybe even the hardest one we've had yet. Immediately, the original trilogy seems to have an advantage, but I do think nostalgia and iconography play a really large role in that. Boba is the most overrated character in movie history. The Ewoks are at best cute and inoffensive, but many consider them a huge black mark on the trilogy and Climax of Jedi especially. Jabba and Tarkin are cool and imposing, but not overly developed. A side character doesn't need endless depth, but some is always welcome. Yoda and Lando are pretty great, Yoda especially, acting as our vessel into the Force for the very first time and allowing us to understand it wonderfully. A great cast of side characters to be sure, but is it better than the ones we see in episodes 1 through 3? I don't know. I think so, though. Darth Maul is insanely cool, but none of that is shown in these movies aside from literally his lightsaber and his iconic battle theme. General Grievous is kinda ham-fisted into episode 3 as a random boss battle, though his design is cool as heck, and again, the Clone Wars make him genuinely intriguing and super interesting. Jar Jar is Jar Jar, and he's super annoying, but pretty fun at times too, and Windu and Yoda both help fill out the Jedi Council in meaningful ways, offering opposing personalities for our main characters to bounce off of. Yoda fighting like a ping pong ball and shouting at war tactics didn't exactly sit well with everyone, but I do like seeing how skilled a fighter he was back when he had to be. Another tough one. If not for Luke and Han, the sequels would come in last, no question, but they do complicate things. I love this iteration of Luke. I think it's one of the best aspects of this trilogy. Becoming jaded, cynical, losing his faith, I think that's a very natural progression for a character many people, including himself, refer to as a living legend. Perhaps it wasn't always showcased excellently, but him sensing untapped evil in a young student and feeling compelled to act before it was too late is a great concept. The Jedi aren't exactly big on mentoring or teaching at times. They denied Qui-Gon his Padawan, Anakin, because they sensed fear in him. Done. No debate, no argument, just now. He's scared and too old, fuck him. Presumably Luke fought for a while to quell the growing darkness in Kylo, but at some point had to deem his attempts moot, thus he decided he had only one option left. That, in some interpretations, is the Jedi way. That decision, as well as the aftermath, crippled him mentally and spiritually. And Han is just good old Han with a fun and classic personality, some good lines, some good actions, good scene presence, and he doesn't overstay his welcome. I think this trilogy absolutely fell apart as it went on, but at the time of his death there were a lot of theories and reasons as to why Kylo killed him in that fashion. Not least of them being that Han felt he had to die to save his son, or that he took a gamble on being able to connect with his son in such a manner that he could save him from the darkness. That death could have, and probably should have, been a much larger weight on Kylo as the trilogy progressed. So in terms of Han's handling, I give it high marks. Plus, just like with Luke, it would have felt odd if he was just around for the rest of the trilogy. At his age, with what he'd already done and accomplished, I think it's safe to say we didn't need to see his character undergo any massive growth or change. I am officially declaring this one our closest category yet. On one hand, you've got the original trilogy, who, although I do think nostalgia itself plays a mighty large role, the side characters do get good characterization. They affect the plot and our main characters in meaningful ways, and they're a little more consistent. None of them, only one of them, absolutely suck. Compare that to the prequels, who, as I said, there's basically no characters we all agree are handled well in this trilogy, aside from maybe Windu, who honestly just doesn't have that large of a presence. Divisive isn't bad, but I think when analyzing critically, it's less that some love it and some hate it, and more that every character just has their good moments and their bad ones. Then we go to the sequels, where 2 are handled wonderfully, and the rest kinda super suck. Leia is good, I guess, and I can't tell if I want to give extra marks for handling pre-existing characters so well, or punish them for being only able to handle side characters well if they were already pre-established. Because Rose, Snoke, DJ, Yana, Hux, Pride, God, Phasma, they all range from useless to horribly handled. I think that settles it. The prequels don't really have numerous side characters they substantially drop the ball with. 3 points to the originals, 2 to the prequels, 1 to the sequels. This is probably the one I want to give second and third place 1.5 marks the most, but my ranking scale is sacred and my morals will not yield. If even one new side character in the sequels were handled particularly well, they'd be getting the 2 points, but not quite good enough, Disney. Not good enough. Not good enough! Which trilogy has the best setting? Bit of a quicker one here, where I am describing setting as the present world this story takes place in. The political climate plays a large role, as does how the world feels and acts. The original trilogy began everything, and they created the lore of the old Jedi Order, the rise of the Sith, Anakin transforming into Darth Vader, etc, etc. Big marks for creating it all and allowing, quite frankly, too much future content to exist before the original trilogy took place. But in my opinion, the best part about the prequels is its setting. Granted, Episode 1 was pretty useless, and even Episode 2 could have taken place a bit sooner along the Order 66 timeline, but still, the events transpiring during Revenge of the Sith are fantastic, and regardless of how various scenes played out, assassination attempts on the opposing army's general, Anakin killing Dooku at the Chancellor's behest, the failed attempt to arrest the Chancellor after a plot to uncover some of his mysteries resulting in Windu's death, Yoda exiling himself, Palpatine taking over the Senate, Obi-Wan fighting his brother to the death, the list goes on. The war, the double life of Palpatine controlling both sides, the execution of Order 66, fuck yeah, that shit's sick. We get to see a ton of cool new planets, we see the Jedi Order in all its glory, and we see its flaws on full display. Those moments I listed earlier aren't necessarily the setting, but this trilogy's political and ideological setting allows for scenes like that to occur, hence their mention. I think a Jedi temple with masters, knights, padawans, and younglings alike is so goddamn cool, and even if we didn't get to explore it as much as I would have liked, it doesn't matter. The Clone Wars is probably my favorite piece of Star Wars content, and it was only able to exist and flourish because of the interesting dynamic this trilogy's setting created. Unlike with the characters, where they were sorta cool and then the show made them much better, this setting on the planets, religions, faiths, and corruptions that existed and blossomed here was already fantastic, and the Clone Wars just built off of it even more. On the other hand, the sequels took an old idea and didn't really twist it or reinterpret it in any meaningful ways. Everyone can name a handful of planets from the first two trilogies, but I struggle to name any aside from a few from The Force Awakens and then maybe Exegol, only because that planet is an absolute train wreck of a concept. Speaking of concepts, the concept of yet another evil empire oppressing the galaxy and a resistance slowly struggling to combat them was already done, and in my opinion here they just didn't do anything cool or new enough with it for it not to feel trite and boring pretty darn fast. 3 points to the prequels, 2 to the original, 1 for the sequels. This one actually wasn't that good, my bad. Which trilogy has the best version of my chaotic category called production? Now a chaotic category, as the title suggests. We're going to call it production, and we're mostly going to be discussing dialogue, sets, acting, choreography, CGI, and practical effects, essentially primarily how it looks and sounds. While the original trilogy had exceptional practical effects that frankly still confound people to this day, George Lucas, in all of his infinite wisdom, reckoned that you know what people would like more than incredible 70s effects that look just a bit outdated but super impressive nonetheless? Horrific looking GameCube graphics jarringly shoved into familiar and beloved scenes for no reason. An assault on the eyes as much as it is the heart, but the stuff they've left alone and did back then is nothing short of miraculous. No hyperbole intended, nor committed. The dialogue is serviceable. Lucas has never been good at that, obviously, we'll get to that in a minute, but during these movies he had a team of people helping him write them, as well as stopping lines like this,
"Now this is pod racing,"
from actually making it into the movies. So not bad. Acting was great, but I do think it took a good dip in episode 6, particularly in regards to Harrison Ford, who just didn't want to be there anymore, but even Carrie Fisher to some degree. Mark Hamill is certainly picking up the slack though, as is Ian McDiarmid to only a slightly lesser degree. The sets are good and integrated really well, a lot of the iconic battles have great backdrops, and stuff like the decision to change Luke's saber to green to contrast the blue sky was a great choice that did make it look far more distinct. The original trilogy is pretty solid in this regard, which is not the sentiment I'll be uttering for what came next, because the prequels are pretty fucking despicable when it comes to this stuff. The lifeless sets and execrable dialogue is probably his biggest and second biggest problem, but not far behind is some of the terrible moments of acting which, I will admit, is a little bit better than I used to give it credit for. A lot of this has to do more with poor direction and the aforementioned awful dialogue, but an overlooked aspect of poor dialogue and acting is delivering all of your lines in front of a green screen. How much harder must it be to get yourself in character and into the moment when instead of being inside the regal and gorgeous Jedi temple, you've got a thick projector behind you? Shoot a climactic scene on an island in Ireland or an indoor studio in downtown LA. I understand you can't always shoot on location. As far as I understand, we still don't even know where Mustafar is. But we've got places that look like it that would have given these scenes a lot more frickin' heart and soul. Aside from locations, even just the sets being predominantly CGI likewise aided the actors in feeling less involved than they could have been. And it being 2000, some of it wasn't even integrated very well. To be fair, some of it was. Jar Jar looks goddamn great for 1999, and the end battle in Attack of the Clones, which was the very first entirely CGI battle scene by the way, actually looked and felt powerful and impactful. They did really well in those. General Grievous looks great too, and I love the way he sounds. There is some good to be found, but too much of this trilogy is tough to look at and tough to listen to as well, and I think that speaks for itself. The choreography is pretty decent. Some suck, some are great, some are overrated, some are underrated, but through and through they're pretty solid. The original trilogy is a bit off because some fights look like two 9-year-olds swinging their canes at each other, but they were still impactful and emotional, and that matters more to me now than how cool it looked. Plus, they got better with every movie. Is this thing on? Okay. The sequels look and sound the best. There, I said it. I said it! This dialogue is better than the prequels by a long shot, and I don't think substantially worse or better than the original. The original probably had better things to say, but it wasn't delivered or acted far better, if that makes sense. We're not really talking about the writing of the story per se. Every interaction in the prequels felt either cringy, boring, or just weird. We don't have that here as much. Choreography-wise, it lacks, to say the least. I think a lot of the action is handled well, but they really lack in the lightsaber battles in multiple different ways. I don't really think I need to express why that's such an important element to this franchise, but the sets look great, they're full of life, and they're cool and expressive. The acting is always great, and the CGI and effects are too. The prequels are the only ones that suffer dramatically in terms of that, since the sequels look the best, but the original trilogy looks so unbelievable for that time period. So I think it's easy to see who I think comes in last here. Acting, visuals, dialogue, and sets, there's no competition. The prequels come in last by a lot. Choreography is as good as it is bad, but that's not enough to save it. Oh, and all the trilogies have excellent scores, obviously, but I'd say each trilogy is just a touch worse because they incorporate such similar designs and themes that when it's at its most original, I just also think that's when it's at its best. I also think something somewhat similar for the editing, though again the originals had a slight leg up in terms of utilizing creative editing and cuts for the first time. Neither of these were categories I dove into too deeply, however, but I don't feel like they would have dramatically tipped the scales in any direction. The editing and score is usually great in this franchise, but again, probably just a little bit better earlier on. Overall, sequels versus original, well, maybe just to give the sequels a much needed win here, I am leaning that way. Even the mess that is The Rise of Skywalker had good acting, good effects, and fine dialogue. What they were actually doing and why they were doing it were the issues. The original trilogy has iconic practical effects, but Lucas decided to fuck that up by adding in horrible and unnecessary CGI monsters and shoving in a Jabba scene that fucks up the pacing. Not to mention shit like clunky. So that's on him. We're going 3 points to the sequels, 2 to the originals, 1 for the prequels. And that's the end. But before we go over the final results, let's talk about 2 things we didn't discuss: the pacing and the lore. Pacing ties into the quality of a movie to an insane amount, so I feel as though in comparing the individual movies, we already touched on pacing. The ones that are paced well generally rank higher and vice versa. Where lore is concerned, well, it's really hard. The originals were the originals, and they had fantastic world building. That's one of the reasons Empire is so highly regarded as an immaculate sequel. It created this sprawling, expansive, beautiful world that has the ability to host more different types of stories than any franchise in history. So how do you really compare that against the very stories this trilogy allowed to exist? Creation and execution? Because that's kind of what we just did, diving into how the movies fared and how they handled and devised the characters within them. Each trilogy has their pros and cons, and I just think this category more than any other category is, well, they all did what they did, created what they created, and this video isn't really about deciding which idea or concept is best. But let's go over the final point totals. In third place, with 12 points, to probably very few people's surprise, is the sequels. Although they suffered in more ways than just one, I think their biggest issue was consistency. They handled some stuff really well, but when it came to analyzing even just a whole category like villains, they dropped the ball in way too many ways for me to give them high marks. They nailed Kylo, failed with literally every single other one. Awesome opening movie, horrible finale. Great side characters like Luke, and then confusing and misguided ones like Holdo. In second place, with 15 points, is the prequels, and I think here they just did not do well for 66% of the trilogy, and then they decided to try to actually do something cool and moving and pulled it off really well in the finale. If that movie's time period made up the brunt of this trilogy, I think they could have made things a lot more interesting and impactful, but no worries either way because the Clone Wars came in and nailed it. And in first place, with a whopping 21 points, also to no one's surprise, is the original trilogy. And they just succeeded in doing everything better than at least somebody, finishing with 0 third place results. Truly the benchmark for Star Wars greatness, particularly in regards to episodes 4 and 5, I can only hope that one day this franchise's movies will return to that level of quality and global impact. And that's that! I guess we can stop the feuding now. We've got an objective answer. You guys can go home. We've solved it with a video essay.
I'm satisfied. Yeah, same here. It wasn't my favorite video in the world, but he made some good points.
I'm gonna like and subscribe.
I haven't subscribed yet. Yeah, I've been meaning to. You gotta subscribe.